The neon flickering of the Club Noir sign didn't just illuminate the alley. It pulsed with a rhythmic, bruising violet that matched the thrumming of Greta's panicked heart. She skidded to a halt, her heels splashing into a rain-slicked gutter, the metallic scent of wet pavement and garbage filling her lungs. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Billie's boots was getting closer, accompanied by the ragged, terrifying shouts of a man who had finally lost his mind. Greta looked left, then right, finding herself cornered against a brick wall, and a man. He stood like a monolith in the shadows of a ramen shop's exhaust vent, a tall, stoic figure in a black suit that cost more than Greta's life. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was simply watching the chaos of the night with eyes as cold and obsidian as the city skyline. Greta didn't think. She moved on pure, animal instinct. She threw herself into his space, her fingers curling into the fine wool of his lapels as she pressed her tear-stained face against his. Before he could shove her away, she stood on her tiptoes and pressed a desperate, trembling kiss to his cheek, whispering a plea into the skin of a man who smelled of expensive tobacco and impending death. Leonard J. Salinas didn't flinch. He didn't push her back into the rain. As Billie burst into the alley, lunging forward with a snarl of "Give her back," Leonard's tattooed hands, thick with the ink of the Salinas syndicate, slowly came up to steady her. He didn't look at the screaming man. He looked down at Greta, his gaze dropping to the faint, yellowing mark on her neck that her red dress couldn't quite hide. He whispered a question that turned the humid night air into ice. "Is he the one I have to kill?" Leonard whispered, the question intended only for Greta's ear, yet it carried with the weight of a signed death warrant. Greta shivered, the tears finally breaking and hot against her cheeks. She had spent months running from a monster she knew. Now, she was clinging to a god of the underworld she didn't know at all. She looked up at Leonard, seeing the most feared man not as a headline or a rumor, but as a shield carved from ice and ink. She didn't answer with words. She simply buried her face in his chest and nodded. The heavy click of a safety being disengaged echoed through the narrow alley, a sound of deafening, terrifying finality. The chase was over, but Greta's world was just beginning to burn. Greta never expected to be seeking sanctuary in the arms of the most feared man in the underworld. 6 months ago, she was a professional with a future, planning a life that didn't involve checking the locks on her doors 4 times a night. That life had shattered the moment Billie R. Henry decided that if he couldn't own her, no one could. He wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was a stalker with connections to the street gangs that crawled through the city's veins. To escape the shadow of a man who promised to break her, Greta had just leaped into the fire of a man who could burn the whole city down to keep her. The heavy silence of the alleyway didn't just fall. It solidified, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. Billie's scream of possessive rage was cut short, not by a retort from the stranger, but by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man Greta was clinging to. Leonard J. Salinas didn't look at Billie with the heat of a rival. He looked at him with the chilling, clinical distance of a man observing a nuisance that was about to be erased. "Greta, get away from him!" Billie's voice cracked, his bravado beginning to leak out of him as he took in the razor-sharp cut of Leonard's suit and the lethal stillness of his posture. He lunged forward, his arm outstretched to snag the silk of Greta's red dress, his fingers hooked like claws. He never reached her. The shadows at the mouth of the alley seemed to materialize into flesh and bone. 2 men, dressed in the same somber, expensive black as Leonard, stepped from the periphery of the Club Noir's violet glow. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that suggested years of shared violence. Before Billie could even register their presence, the taller of the two caught his lunging arm, twisting it behind his back with a sickening, wet pop of a dislocating shoulder. Billie's scream was a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the brick walls. The second man stepped in, delivering a short, brutal blow to Billie's midsection that folded him in half. There was no struggle, no cinematic back and forth. It was a professional neutralization, swift, quiet, and absolute. "Sir?" the taller man asked, his voice a low, emotionless drone. He held Billie by the scruff of his neck, the aggressor now nothing more than a trembling heap of terrified flesh. Leonard didn't answer immediately. His attention was entirely focused on Greta. He could feel the frantic, bird-like thrumming of her pulse against his palm. He didn't let go of her head, his fingers remaining anchored in her damp curls, forcing her to look up at him. The cold obsidian of his eyes searched hers, looking for a sign of regret or hesitation. He found only the raw, jagged edges of a woman who had reached the end of her rope. "He's nobody," Leonard finally said, his voice a dark velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Greta's bones. He wasn't talking to his men. He was telling Greta. He was redefining her reality. "He is a ghost who hasn't realized he's dead yet." Leonard turned his gaze back to his enforcers. "Scrub him. I don't want to hear his voice again tonight. And find out who he thinks he's working for. Nobody follows a woman into my territory without a death wish." "Understood, Mr. Salinas," the man replied. With a grunt, they dragged Billie deeper into the shadows behind the ramen shop. Billie tried to shout, to plead, but a heavy hand was clamped over his mouth, silencing him with terrifying finality. Greta shivered, a violent, full-body tremor that she couldn't suppress. The adrenaline that had carried her through the streets was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She felt the strength leave her legs, her knees buckling as the world began to tilt. She expected to hit the wet pavement. Instead, Leonard's arm tightened around her waist like a band of iron. In one fluid motion, he swept her off her feet, cradling her against his chest. The smell of him, tobacco, rain, and something ancient and dangerous, enveloped her, creating a strange, dark cocoon of safety. "The car," Leonard commanded. He walked out of the alleyway, his stride long and purposeful. He didn't look back at the violence occurring in the shadows behind him. He stepped out onto the main thoroughfare, where a sleek, matte black sedan was already idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the neon chaos of the city. A driver held the rear door open, bowing his head in a gesture of profound respect that made Greta's breath hitch. Leonard slid into the back seat, never relinquishing his hold on her. He settled her onto his lap, the leather of the interior cool against her bare legs. As the door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud, the sounds of the city, the music from Club Noir, the splashing of rain, the distant sirens were instantly severed. In the dim, ambient light of the car's interior, Leonard looked down at her. His expression remained a mask of stoic ice, but his thumb continued that slow, possessive stroke along her jawline. "You made a very specific choice tonight, Greta Wright," he whispered, his voice a low promise of protection and imprisonment. "You chose the monster to save you from the man. Do you have any idea what that cost is?" Greta looked at the intricate tattoos on his forearms, the ink of a syndicate that ruled the city's heart, and then up at the protective, cold fire in his eyes. She didn't know the cost, and in that moment she didn't care. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered. Leonard's grip tightened, a silent acceptance of the deal. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the neon-streaked veins of the underworld, Greta let her eyes close, surrendering herself to the shadow of the most feared man in the city. The silence of the room was the first thing that terrified her. It wasn't the empty silence of a lonely apartment or the heavy, threatening silence of a closet where she used to hide from Billie's rages. This was a pressurized, expensive silence, the kind that felt like it was maintained by 1,000 invisible hands. Greta's eyes snapped open, her breath catching in a throat that felt like it had been scrubbed with sand. The ceiling above her was high, adorned with intricate crown molding that glowed like bone in the soft, morning light. She was lying on silk sheets so cool and smooth they felt like water against her skin. For a blissful, disorienting second, she thought she was back in her old life, before the stalking, before the bruises, before the rain. Then the memory of the alleyway hit her like a physical blow. The violet neon, the smell of tobacco, the cold, obsidian eyes of the man who had carried her through the rain. She sat up abruptly, the silk sheets sliding down to reveal that someone, a woman, she hoped, had replaced her torn red dress with a heavy, charcoal gray silk robe. Her heart began to gallop against her ribs as she surveyed the room. It was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. The furniture was minimalist and dark, carved from heavy woods that looked like they could withstand a siege. Large floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but the glass was thick, tinted, and reinforced with subtle steel tracks. She wasn't in a hospital. She wasn't in a hotel. Greta swung her legs off the bed, her feet sinking into a rug so plush it felt like walking on a cloud. She moved toward a heavy oak desk near the window, her eyes landing on a single object resting on the polished surface. A small, black lacquered box. Beside it lay a morning newspaper, its headline detailing a gangland disturbance in the district she had fled only hours ago. Her hand trembled as she reached for the box, but a sudden sound made her freeze. The door didn't creak. It moved with a silent, hydraulic precision. Framed in the doorway was a woman in a sharp, slate-colored suit. Her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She held a silver tray with a porcelain tea service. "You're awake," the woman said. Her voice was professional, devoid of warmth but also devoid of threat. "Mr. Salinas expected you would be. He is finishing a meeting in the study." "Salinas?" Greta whispered, the name tasting like ash and iron on her tongue. "Leonard Salinas." The woman set the tray down on a low table. "He prefers to be addressed as Mr. Salinas, or simply the chairman." Greta felt a cold drip of dread slide down her spine. She wasn't just a guest. The chairman was a title whispered in the city's darkest corners, a name associated with the Salinas syndicate, the organization that controlled the ports, the high-rise developments, and the silent, invisible flow of power that kept the city's heart beating. She hadn't just kissed a stranger to escape an ex. She had kissed the apex predator of the entire Pacific Rim. "I need to leave," Greta said, her voice rising with a frantic edge. She gripped the edge of the silk robe. "I'm grateful for the help, truly, but I can't stay here." "The gates are locked for your protection, Ms. Wright," the woman replied, not looking up from the tea she was pouring. Mr. Henry spent the night in a precinct basement. His associates, however, are currently looking for you with a level of desperation that makes the streets unsafe. Greta's knees felt weak. Billie is in jail? He is being processed for a variety of historical oversights Mr. Salinas's legal team brought to the attention of the authorities, the woman said, finally looking Greta in the eye. But you must understand. You chose a side in an alleyway last night. In this city, you cannot unchoose the Salinas family. The woman stepped back and gestured toward the door. The chairman is ready for you. He doesn't like to be kept waiting. Greta followed the woman through a corridor that felt more like an art gallery than a home. Every few yards, a man in a dark suit stood perfectly still, an earpiece glinting in the light. They didn't look at her, but she felt their presence like a physical weight. They reached a set of double doors at the end of the hall. The woman knocked once and stepped aside. Greta took a shaky breath and pushed the doors open. The study was vast, lined with books and smelling of old paper and the same expensive tobacco she remembered from the night before. Leonard J. Salinas sat behind a massive desk of petrified wood. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink of the serpents that had looked so terrifying in the violet light of Club Noir. He didn't look up immediately. He was signing a stack of documents with a fountain pen, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the room. Greta stood in the center of the room, feeling small and exposed in her borrowed silk. Finally, Leonard capped the pen and leaned back. His obsidian eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Greta felt the same magnetic pull that had driven her to kiss him in the rain. "The color has returned to your face," he observed. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that seemed to command the very air in the room to go still. "Who are you?" Greta asked, though she already knew. She needed to hear him say it. Leonard stood, his height even more intimidating in the daylight. He walked around the desk, his movements liquid and controlled. He stopped just inches from her, the heat of his body acting as a silent reminder of the car ride where she had slept against his chest. "I am the man who holds the keys to your safety," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray curl of her dark hair. "And I am the man you claimed as your own in front of the entire world. Do you know what happens to people who lie to the Salinas syndicate, Greta?" Greta swallowed hard. "I wasn't lying. I was dying." "Perhaps," Leonard said, his gaze dropping to her lips. "But when you kissed me, you didn't just ask for a favor. You asked for a war. And I have already started it." He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like the gilded cage she now resided in. "You are no longer running from Billie Henry. You are under the Salinas shadow. And in this house, there are no ghosts, only property and family. We need to decide which one you are." The morning light in the study was unforgiving. It didn't just illuminate the room. It interrogated it, bouncing off the polished surfaces of the petrified wood desk and the sharp, obsidian edges of Leonard's gaze. He didn't move as Greta stood before him. He simply watched her, his presence a silent demand for a truth she had spent months trying to bury. "The robe," Leonard said. "It wasn't a request. It was an observation that carried the weight of a command. Take it off." Greta flinched, her fingers instinctively tightening around the charcoal gray silk. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen were being rationed. Her mind flashed back to the many times Billie had demanded things from her, demands that were always followed by the sound of a hand striking skin or the shattering of glass. But the man standing before her wasn't vibrating with Billie's erratic, alcoholic rage. Leonard was still. He was a predator waiting for the wind to change. I don't have anything on under it, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the estate's climate control. I am not interested in your modesty, Greta. I am interested in the ledger of your debts, Leonard replied, his voice a low, melodic baritone that offered no room for negotiation. He stepped toward her, the serpents on his forearms appearing to coil and uncoil with the movement of his muscles. The woman who dressed you told me you were hesitant to let her touch you. She told me you flinched when she reached for the towel. I want to see why. With trembling hands, Greta slowly loosened the sash. The silk parted, sliding down her shoulders to pool at her elbows, exposing the pale skin of her collarbone and ribs. She didn't let the robe fall completely, but it was enough. The light caught the marks immediately. They weren't fresh. Most were in the yellowing, greenish stage of healing, but they were unmistakable. There was a thumbprint bruise on her shoulder, the faint outline of a grip on her bicep, and the jagged, dark blotch near her ribs where Billie had pinned her against a kitchen counter 3 nights ago. Leonard didn't speak. He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, agonizing precision. Greta closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, she felt the ghost-light touch of his fingertips hovering just a fraction of an inch above the bruise on her ribs. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace hidden behind a wall of ice. 6 months? Leonard murmured, his voice dropping into a register that made the floorboards beneath Greta's feet seem to hum. That is how long the police records say you've been moving. 3 different apartments. 2 restraining orders that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Tell me the rest. Greta opened her eyes. Looking into the depths of Leonard's gaze was like looking into the heart of a storm. He wasn't always like this, she began, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if breaking a dam. He was charming. He was a protector. But the protection turned into a cage. He started small, checking my phone, asking why I was 5 minutes late from work. Then the drinking started. He lost his job at the docks, and suddenly, everything was my fault. My existence was an insult to him. She took a shuddering breath, her ribs aching with the movement. He told me that if I ever left, he'd find me. He said he had friends in the city who could see through walls. I thought he was just posturing until I moved the first time. He was there the next morning, sitting on my car. I tried to go to the precinct, but the officer told me there was nothing they could do unless he physically touched me again. And then he touched you, Leonard said, his eyes darkening until the iris and pupil were one. He did more than touch me. He broke into my last place. He told me that since I liked running so much, he was going to make sure I couldn't walk for a month. That's when I ran into the night. That's when I saw you. Leonard finally let his hand make contact. He didn't press down. He simply rested his palm against the side of her waist, his thumb grazing the edge of the darkest bruise. It wasn't a sexual touch. It was the touch of a man inspecting a damaged piece of property he had just acquired, or perhaps the touch of an architect looking at a ruin he intended to rebuild. He is a small man, Leonard said, the words dripping with a quiet, lethal contempt. He uses his fists because he has no power. He uses fear because he has no respect. He thinks his friends on the street give him reach. Leonard leaned in, his lips inches from Greta's ear. I have spent 20 years building a world where the only thing that moves without my permission is the tide. When you kissed me in that alley, you didn't just find a shield. You found a master who does not tolerate his things being broken by others." He pulled back, his expression returning to that stoic, unreadable mask. But the air in the room remained charged with a violent intent. "Billie Henry is currently sitting in a cell, but he will be out by noon. My lawyers can only hold a man like him for so long before questions are asked. He will come looking for you. He will go to your old apartment. He will go to your workplace." "Then I have to go," Greta said, her panic returning. "I can't bring this to your door. If he knows I'm here." "He already knows," Leonard interrupted, his voice flat. "And that is exactly why you are staying. He thinks he is a wolf because he harassed a lamb. He is about to find out what happens when a wolf bites the heel of a dragon." Leonard reached out and pulled the silk robe back up onto her shoulders, his movements surprisingly gentle as he closed the fabric over her marks. He tied the sash himself, his knots tight and secure. "Go back to your room," he commanded. "Eat, rest. My physician will be up to see to those ribs within the hour. From this moment on, you do not mention his name. You do not look at those bruises and think of him. You think of me, because I am the only thing standing between you and the grave he dug for you, and I do not like to lose what belongs to me." Greta watched him as he walked back to his desk, already dismissing her as he picked up his fountain pen. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the danger. She had simply traded a chaotic, small-scale nightmare for a grand, organized one. As she turned to leave the study, she caught her reflection in the glass of a bookshelf. The red dress was gone, the rain was dry, but the marks were still there, and for the first time, she wondered if the man in the black suit was going to leave marks of his own. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the jagged skyline of the city, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rugs of Leonard's study. The air in the room remained cool, but the atmosphere had shifted from the clinical tension of the morning to something far more volatile. Leonard sat behind his desk, the blue light of a sleek laptop illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He wasn't looking at Greta, who sat perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, her fingers twisted into the silk of her robe. He was looking at a series of encrypted chat logs and grainy surveillance stills. The silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Leonard was tapping his fountain pen against a tablet, a sound like a ticking clock in a room where time felt increasingly expensive. "Tell me, Greta," Leonard said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "When you lived with Billie, did he ever mention the name Xing?" Greta frowned, the name tasting like cold copper. "No. He didn't have many friends, just guys from the docks. Men who drank until they couldn't stand and talked about how the world owed them something." "Why?" Leonard turned the laptop screen around. It showed a map of the city's waterfront, dotted with red markers that didn't belong to the Salinas syndicate. "Because Billie Henry is a far more industrious rat than I gave him credit for. He didn't just spend the night in a cell nursing his pride. He spent it reaching out to the one group in the city foolish enough to think they can contest my borders. The snakeheads." Greta felt the blood drain from her face. Even a civilian knew of the snakeheads, a ruthless, disorganized but violent gang that specialized in human trafficking and waterfront extortion. They were the scavengers of the underworld, picking at the edges of territories held by men like Leonard. "Why would they help him?" she whispered. "Billie has nothing. He's a nobody." "Billie has you," Leonard replied, his eyes snapping to hers with the force of a physical strike. "Or rather, he has the knowledge of where you are. He didn't just tell them he lost his woman. He told them he was chased into an alley by the chairman of the Salinas syndicate. He told them I took you. He's feeding them my movements, my security protocols at the East Gate, and the location of the safe house you fled from, all in exchange for enough muscle to take you back. Leonard stood, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. He looked down at the sprawling estate below, where guards in dark suits moved like chess pieces across the lawn. He sold me out to buy your return. He's convinced them that if they help him snatch you from my shadow, it will prove I am vulnerable. He's turned your domestic nightmare into a political provocation. I didn't know, Greta said, her voice trembling. I swear, I thought he was just obsessed. I didn't think he was capable of this. Desperate men are capable of many things when they realize their prey has found a bigger cage, Leonard said, turning back to her. His expression was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough for Greta to see the fine, white lines of scars on his knuckles, reminders of the wars he had already won. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone. He set it on the table between them. 3 calls were made from the precinct before my lawyers could shut him down. All 3 went to a burner phone registered to a snakehead lieutenant. They're planning a move, Greta. They think they can use the abused boyfriend narrative as a smokescreen to hit one of my transport hubs while I'm distracted by your safety. Leonard leaned down, his hands resting on the arms of her chair, effectively pinning her in place. The scent of tobacco and ozone flared around her. He didn't just bruise your ribs, Greta. He's trying to burn down my empire to get his hands back on the throat he thinks he owns. What are you going to do? Greta asked, her breath hitching. I am going to remind the snakeheads why they stay in the gutters, Leonard whispered, his thumb catching her chin and forcing her to look at the lethal promise in his eyes. And as for Billie, he is no longer just a man who hit a woman. He is a traitor to the peace I maintain in this city. In my world, we don't put restraining orders on rats. We exterminate them. He straightened up, his silhouette framed by the darkening city. Stay in this room. Lock the door. My men are intercepting a snakehead courier at the docks within the hour. By the time the sun comes up, Billie Henry will realize that the alleyway was the safest place he'll ever be again. Because now he isn't just running from the law. He is being hunted by the Salinas syndicate. As Leonard walked toward the door, his long coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark god, Greta realized that the gilded cage had just become a bunker. The war hadn't just reached her door. She was the flag they were fighting over. And as the door clicked shut with that familiar, terrifying finality, she realized that Leonard Salinas didn't just protect what was his. He destroyed anything that dared to touch it. The city didn't scream when Leonard Salinas began his work. It held its breath. For Greta, the war remained a distant, rhythmic thrum felt through the reinforced floors of the estate. But for the streets of the waterfront, it was a night of surgical precision and absolute silence. Greta stood by the window of her room, watching the headlights of black SUVs depart from the main gate in intervals of exactly 10 minutes. She was still wrapped in the charcoal silk, the weight of it a constant reminder of the man who had claimed her. She felt like a storm-tossed bird that had found refuge in the eye of a hurricane, safe for the moment, but acutely aware of the destruction rotating just beyond the glass. Across the city, the cleaning began at a dive bar called the Rusty Hook, a haunt where Billie's dockside associates gathered to trade stolen goods and hollow boasts. Leonard didn't send a small army. He sent 3 men and a message. They didn't fire a single shot. They simply walked in, systematically broke the hands of the two men who had helped Billie track Greta's first apartment, and left a single black business card on the blood-spattered bar top. It was a lesson in the hierarchy of pain. Billie's friends were being dismantled not for what they had done, but for whom they had served. By midnight, Leonard returned to the study. He didn't look tired. He looked settled, as if the violence of the evening had smoothed out the jagged edges of his temper. He found Greta waiting for him, not in her room, but standing near his desk. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice a low, dark velvet that cut through the silence of the room. He shed his overcoat, revealing the holster strapped over his white shirt, the steel of the weapon glinting under the dim lamps. "I can't sleep while people are being hurt because of me," Greta said, her voice steadier than it had been that morning. "I heard the cars. I saw the news reports of unrelated accidents at the docks. You're tearing the city apart to find a man who isn't worth the effort." Leonard walked toward her, the scent of gunpowder and rain clinging to his clothes. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow swallowing her completely. "You think this is about effort, Greta? You think I am doing this because I am angry at a small man like Billie?" He reached out, his tattooed hand closing gently but firmly around her nape, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "This is about the mechanics of power. If I allow a man like Billie to touch what I have claimed, I am telling the city that my borders are porous. I am telling the snakeheads that they can use my interests as a playground. Every associate of his that I break is a word in a sentence that ends with his absolute erasure." "And what happens to the girl in the middle of that sentence?" Greta whispered, her breath hitching as his thumb moved to her lower lip. "The girl is the prize," Leonard murmured, his eyes darkening to the color of a midnight sea. "And the prize stays in the vault." He pulled her closer, his gaze dropping to the faint yellowing marks on her skin that his physician had treated earlier. "Tonight," Billie realized, "he has no friends left. I have bought the loyalty of his bosses and the silence of his brothers. He is currently hiding in a basement in the slums, realizing that he didn't just lose a woman. He lost the right to exist in my city. That is the lesson, Greta. Power isn't just about the ability to strike. It's about the ability to make your enemy realize that striking back is a physical impossibility." Greta looked up at him, seeing the lethal beauty in his cold, protective logic. She realized then that Leonard wasn't just protecting her from Billie. He was rewriting her entire world so that Billie was no longer a ghost that could haunt her. He was making him a non-entity. "You're a monster," she whispered, though her hands had found their way to his chest, anchoring her to the only solid thing she knew. "I am the monster you chose," Leonard replied, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "And as long as you are under my shadow, you will never have to be afraid of the dark again. Because I own the dark." As the city outside continued to bleed out the last of Billie's influence, Greta let her eyes close, leaning into the terrifying safety of the Salinas syndicate. The lesson was learned. Billie was being erased, and in his place, Leonard was building a throne. The following 3 days were defined by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Within the walls of the Salinas estate, the world was composed of soft silk, gourmet meals, and the occasional heavy presence of Leonard J. Salinas watching Greta from across a room. But beyond the iron gates, the city was vibrating with the desperate, dying gasps of Billie R. Henry. Greta sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. She was healing. The yellow bruises on her ribs had faded to faint shadows, and her breathing no longer hitched with pain. But her mind was still trapped in that alleyway, stuck in the moment she had gambled her soul for her life. She was beginning to realize that Leonard didn't just protect things. He absorbed them. The peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a shift in the air. Leonard entered the room, his black suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His face was a mask of cold, focused aggression. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon where the industrial smoke of the waterfront met the blue of the sky. He found a way to be useful to them, Leonard said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. Greta set her cup down, the porcelain clinking sharply against the saucer. Billie. He convinced a cell of snakehead insurgents that I've grown soft, Leonard replied, turning to look at her. The obsidian in his eyes was replaced by a flash of something molten. He told them that because I took you in because I am distracted by a woman, my transit hub at Pier 19 is vulnerable. He didn't just hide Greta. He led them there. The news hit Greta like a physical strike. Pier 19 was the crown jewel of the Salinas logistics empire, the primary artery through which their legitimate and illegitimate goods flowed. For Billie to target it wasn't just a crime. It was a suicide mission designed to prove Leonard's weakness. Is he there now? Greta asked, her heart hammering. He was, Leonard said, his jaw tightening. They hit the north gate 20 minutes ago. It wasn't a robbery. They didn't take cargo. They burned 3 of my trucks and shot 2 of my night watchmen. Billie was seen on the perimeter, shouting your name like a man possessed. He thinks he's a revolutionary. He thinks he's coming to liberate you from the big, bad wolf. Leonard stepped closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold steel radiating from him. He reached out, his hand cupping Greta's cheek. His skin was warm, but his touch felt like an anchor in a storm. He thinks I am weak because I care for what is mine, Leonard whispered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. He thinks that by attacking my business, he can force me to negotiate. He wants to trade the safety of my pier for you. You can't do that, Greta said, her voice trembling. Leonard, if you give me back to him. I am not a man who negotiates with rats, Leonard interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm level. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, forcing her to see the lethal clarity in his gaze. He didn't just attack a pier. He insulted the Salinas name. He made the mistake of thinking my protection of you was a vulnerability, when in reality, it is my greatest motivation for violence. He straightened up, snapping his fingers. 2 of his highest-ranking enforcers appeared in the doorway instantly. Armor the cars, Leonard commanded. I want every snakehead associated with Pier 19 brought to the shipyard. And I want Billie R. Henry kept alive until I arrive. He wanted to see what happens when the chairman is distracted. I am going to show him exactly how focused I can be. He looked back at Greta, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, a brief glimpse of the man behind the monster. Stay in the center of the house. Don't look at the news. When I come back, the name Billie Henry will never be spoken in this city again. As Leonard walked out, his stride echoing with the finality of a funeral march, Greta realized the stakes had shifted. Billie wasn't just an abusive ex anymore. He was a catalyst for a massacre. He had tried to exploit Leonard's humanity, and in doing so, he had ensured that Leonard would show him none. She stood by the window, watching the motorcade roar out of the gates, knowing that the uninvited guest had just signed his own death warrant in fire and blood. The silence following the motorcade's departure was more deafening than the roar of the engines. Greta stood in the grand foyer of the estate, her shadow stretching long and thin across the polished marble. For the first time since she had been brought here, the heavy internal doors were not flanked by guards. Leonard had taken his primary force to the pier, leaving only a skeleton crew on the perimeter. She walked slowly toward the back of the house, her charcoal silk robe whispering against her legs. She found the side entrance to the gardens ajar, a rare lapse in security, or perhaps a calculated test. Beyond the manicured hedges lay the service gate, and beyond that, the city she had once known. She could walk out. She could disappear into a subway station, find a bus to a different coast, and try to weave a new life out of the scraps of her old one. The cool night air hit her face, smelling of jasmine and distant exhaust. She reached the edge of the property, her fingers brushing the cold iron of the gate. She thought of Billie. She thought of the way he had looked at her like a possession to be broken, a mirror intended only to reflect his own ego. To Billie, she was a prize to be won back. To the police, she was a case file. To her friends, she was a cautionary tale they were too busy to read. Then she thought of Leonard. He had looked at her marks not with pity, but with a recognition that felt like a bridge. He hadn't asked her to be fixed or to move on. He had simply stood in the gap between her and her destruction. He saw the nursing student who had lost her way, the woman who had fought for 6 months to survive, and the survivor who had the courage to kiss a monster in a rain-slicked alley. He didn't see a victim. He saw a soul worth a war. "You're going to catch a chill, Ms. Wright." Greta didn't jump. She turned to see the woman who had first served her tea, standing in the shadows of the stone archway. The woman held a small envelope and a set of keys. "The chairman left these for you," the woman said, her voice devoid of its usual professional frost. "There is a car waiting at the end of the block. It isn't a Salinas car. It's clean. There is cash in the envelope and a passport with a name that isn't yours. He said that if you were still here when the sun rose, you would be choosing a life that never ends. But if you wanted to leave, the gate is unlocked." Greta looked at the keys, then back at the dark, looming silhouette of the estate. Leonard had given her the one thing Billie never could, the power to say no. He had offered her the exit she had been praying for since the nightmare began. She realized then that the gilded cage wasn't the house. The cage was the fear that had dictated every step of her life for the last 6 months. If she ran now, she would be running forever. She would be a ghost, always looking over her shoulder for the next Billie, the next shadow, the next bruise. But if she stayed, she would be standing beside the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a person instead of a target. "He's at Pier 19? Greta asked, her voice clear and resonant in the night air. The woman nodded once. "It will be over soon." "No," Greta said, stepping away from the gate and walking back toward the house. She let the keys fall onto the gravel path. "It's just beginning. I don't want the car. I want to be here when he comes home." She walked past the woman, her head held high, the charcoal silk flowing behind her like a banner. She didn't need a new name or a hidden life. She had found a man who fought for her honor because he recognized her worth. She was choosing the monster, not because she was afraid of the dark, but because she finally understood that in a city of predators, the only way to be free was to belong to the king of the jungle. As she entered the house and heard the soft, pressurized click of the door locking behind her, Greta didn't feel trapped. She felt seen. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt entirely dangerously at peace. The air at the mouth of the alley was thick with the scent of ozone, toasted sesame oil, and the copper tang of fresh blood. It was raining again, a fine, misting drizzle that turned the neon signs of Club Noir into bleeding smears of violet and crimson against the asphalt. This was where the loop had begun, and as the black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the ramen shop, it was where the loop would be severed with the cold precision of a surgeon's blade. Leonard J. Salinas stepped out of the car before it had fully stopped. He didn't look like a man in the middle of a gang war. He looked like a god of the underworld returning to his throne. His black suit was immaculate, though his white cuffs were stained with the dark spray of the work he had already finished at Pier 19. Behind him, the shadows of the alleyway bristled with the suppressed silhouettes of his men, but Leonard raised a hand, a silent command for them to hold. This was not a syndicate matter. This was a debt of honor. At the far end of the alley, beneath the flickering light of a broken street lamp, stood Billie R. Henry. He looked like a frantic animal, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a stolen snakehead submachine gun trembling in his grip. He was surrounded by the bodies of the two mercenaries who had been foolish enough to believe his promises of an easy score. They were dead before they hit the ground, but Billie was still breathing, partly out of luck, and partly because Leonard had ordered his snipers to leave the center of the target intact. "Greta!" Billie screamed, his voice a jagged, desperate ruin. He pointed the barrel of the gun toward the sedan, his finger white on the trigger. "Give her back, Salinas. I know she's in there. She's mine. She's always been mine." Leonard walked toward him, his gait slow and rhythmic, his shoes clicking against the wet pavement with the terrifying finality of a clock ticking toward zero. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't seek cover. He simply moved through the rain, his obsidian eyes locked onto Billie with a terrifyingly calm focus. "You speak of her as if she were a ledger entry," Leonard said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through the sound of the rain. "As if she were a ghost you could cage in a room and break until she fit your shadow. You never saw her, Henry. You only saw the space she occupied in your own pathetic life." "Shut up." Billie lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of wounded pride. "I loved her. I took care of her. You bruised her ribs," Leonard countered, his voice dropping into a register that made the brick walls seem to vibrate. "You hunted her through these streets like she was vermin. You sold your soul to the snakeheads to try and reclaim a prize you never earned. And in doing so, you brought fire to my door." Leonard stopped 10 feet away. The violet light of the club sign caught the serpents on his forearms, making them appear to writhe in the mist. "She isn't in the car, Billie. She's at my home, by her own choice. She stayed while the gates were open, and she watched me leave to come here and end you. She didn't ask for mercy. She asked for peace." The realization hit Billie like a physical blow. The gun in his hand wavered, the barrel dipping toward the ground. The obsession that had fueled him for 6 months. The belief that Greta was a victim waiting to be rescued from a different monster. Shattered. He looked at Leonard and saw not a rival, but an end. "I'll kill you," Billie whispered, a final pathetic attempt at bravado. "If I can't have her, no one." He began to raise the weapon, but Leonard was faster than the eye could follow. It wasn't a shootout. It was an execution of intent. Leonard stepped into Billie's space, his hand snapping out to catch the barrel of the gun, twisting it upward with a sickening crack of bone. Before Billie could scream, Leonard's other hand closed around his throat, lifting him off his feet and pinning him against the damp brick wall of the ramen shop. the exact spot where Greta had kissed him. "You are a small, loud man," Leonard whispered, his face inches from Billie's. The heat from Leonard's body was the only warmth in the alley. "And you have reached the end of your breath. Every mark you left on her, I am going to return to you in the seconds you have left. And then, I am going to erase your name from the memory of this city." There was no cinematic struggle. There was only the sound of the rain, the muffled thumping of the music from the club, and the heavy, final snap of a debt being settled. When Leonard stepped back, the alley was silent. He didn't look down at the heap of clothes and broken ambition at his feet. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped a single drop of rain from his cheek, and turned back toward the car. "Clean it," Leonard commanded his men, his voice already returning to the cool, detached tone of the chairman. "I want this alley to look like it did before she found me. No trace. No memory." He slid into the back of the sedan, the door closing with a pressurized thud that severed him from the neon-lit violence of the underworld. As the car pulled away, Leonard looked at his phone. A single message sat on the screen from the estate's internal security. "Ms. Wright is waiting in the study." Leonard leaned back against the leather, his eyes closing for a brief moment. The war for the city was ongoing, but the war for Greta Wright was over. He had ended the pursuit permanently, and in the morning, the sun would rise on a world where Greta was no longer running. She was home. The estate was bathed in the fragile, silver light of dawn when the black sedan coasted through the iron gates. The violence of the night had been scrubbed from the city streets, but its echo lingered in the heavy, pressurized silence of the car's interior. As Leonard J. Salinas stepped out onto the gravel drive, he looked up at the second-floor windows. He didn't see a fugitive hiding behind curtains. He saw a woman standing silhouetted against the morning sun, waiting for the return of the man she had chosen. Greta was in the study when he entered. She had traded the charcoal silk robe for a structured dress of deep crimson, the color of the dress she had worn in the alley, but this time the fabric was thick, expensive, and carried no tears. She stood behind the petrified wood desk, her hands resting flat on its surface. She looked less like a guest and more like a permanent fixture of the room's architecture. Leonard stopped in the doorway. His white shirt was creased, and the scent of rain and gunpowder followed him like a shadow, but his eyes were remarkably clear. The obsidian depths that usually held only cold calculation now burned with a dark, respectful heat. He didn't say a word about Billie. He didn't need to. The way the air in the room had settled told Greta everything she needed to know. The ghost was gone. "The city is quiet," Leonard said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to ground the entire house. "It's a different kind of quiet," Greta replied, her voice steady. "It doesn't feel like a threat anymore. It feels like an audience." Leonard walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't stop until he was standing on the other side of the desk, mirroring her posture. He looked down at her hands, then up at her face. The marks on her neck and ribs were invisible beneath the crimson silk, but the transformation in her gaze was undeniable. The frantic bird that had crashed into his chest at Club Noir had been replaced by something with far sharper talons. "You had the keys to the gate," Leonard murmured, his thumb catching the edge of the desk. "You had the cash and the name. Why are you still in my study, Greta?" "Because a new name doesn't change what I am," she said, stepping around the desk to close the distance between them. "Running made me a shadow. Staying makes me a sovereign. You told me once that I had to decide if I was property or family. I think you left out a third option. Leonard's hand came up, his tattooed fingers grazing the line of her jaw. And what is that? The woman who stands beside the chairman, she whispered. A slow, rare smile touched Leonard's lips, an expression of genuine pride that was more terrifyingly beautiful than his rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a signet ring, crafted from black gold and set with a dark, polished stone etched with the coiled serpents of the Salinas syndicate. He took her hand, his touch warm and absolute, and slid the ring onto her finger. It was heavy, a physical anchor that signaled the end of her flight and the beginning of her reign. It was the Salinas mark. Then the lessons begin today, Leonard said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive promise. You will learn the ledgers. You will learn the faces of the men who serve us and the names of the enemies who fear us. You will never scrub blood out of a rug again, Greta. From now on, you are the one who decides whose blood is spilled. He pulled her flush against him, his arms wrapping around her with a protective force that no longer felt like a cage, but like a fortress. Greta leaned her head back, looking up at the man who had seen her at her most broken and had built her a throne. The city outside was waking up, its neon lights fading as the sun climbed higher, but the world Greta knew was just beginning. She wasn't Greta Wright, the victim of a low-level thug. She was the woman who had tamed the most feared man in the underworld. As Leonard leaned down to seal their new reality with a kiss that tasted of victory and dark silk, Greta let her eyes close. She was no longer running. She was ruling. And in the heart of the Salinas syndicate, the shadows finally belonged to her.